Let people in, and we will start this show. Welcome, everybody. We're just giving a minute for people to join the presentation. We will begin the presentation in just a couple more seconds. I think. Yeah, let's go ahead and start. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming to November's NWSA webinar. This is the national, something was going on with my phone. This is the National Wilderness Stewardship Alliance monthly webinar series. And we're so fortunate today to have with us a couple of experienced volunteer coordinators, managers from the U.S. Forest Service who have worked extensively with volunteers and volunteer agreements over the years. We thought it would be important to have a session that kind of went over the basic paperwork requirements for volunteering on the national forest. You know, we've talked about a lot of other organizational issues and concerns that wilderness stewardship organizations have, but we really haven't dived too deep into some of the practical day-to-day understanding of that relationship with the Forest Service on that paperwork that's needed for a wilderness stewardship organization or an individual to have an effective relationship agreement with the national forest. So we thought we'd spend a little bit of time today, build some background on how that paperwork, what that paperwork looks like, and how it can be used effectively to manage a volunteer program, and for the understanding of the wilderness stewardship groups so that they understand what's being requested, why it's being requested, how it's used by the agency, and how they can, you know, better incorporate the information into their own operations and their own data sets. So with me today, we have Dave Cantrell, our program director at NWSA, who will help moderate the questions and answers period at the end of the presentation. And we have Chelsea Muise, who is the current Wilderness, Wild and Scenic Rivers Specialist for Region 2 of the Forest Service. Chelsea's had a pretty extensive background in the Forest Service, working on a multitude of ranger districts and forests, and has had extensive experience working with these volunteer agreements. And then Kevin Cannon, who is a longtime employee of the Forest Service, currently retired, but he worked on the, I'm going to get the name of it wrong, but on the one of the lakes districts just outside of Fort Collins, there in northern the Arapahoe Roosevelt Ranger District for a long period of time. He's been coordinator with the Poudre Wilderness Volunteers for a long time. So has had extensive experience working with these volunteer agreements in a variety of shapes and forms and fashions. And often Kevin is at the cutting edge of some of the technology improvements in the Forest Service. He is a longstanding member of the Wilderness Information Management team that the Forest Service maintains for anything to do with wilderness management or wilderness data. And so we're real happy to have Chelsea and Kevin here with us today. And so Chelsea, I'm going to go ahead and just turn it over to you. Know that at the end of the presentation, we'll open the floor for questions and answers. You would just be able to type them into the chat. Depending on how many people we actually have, we may open the floor and just let you speak your question, and we'll all come back together and just go through those one by one. So Chelsea, take it away.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much, Randy, for that intro, and thank you to Kevin too for helping assist me with this, as he's been really involved with a lot of volunteer groups. So I'm here to just kind of give the big overall view of volunteer agreements and highlight on some important things as we move along. And then, yeah, Kevin will actually give you the real day to day. Here's how some people are implementing volunteer agreements, tracking time, and making these programs really successful. So just a really quick agenda. We'll do a quick welcome, which we kind of already completed. I'll go into a little bit more detail about the volunteer and service program, and then we'll jump right into the meat and bones of the presentation, which is Volunteer Agreements 101, really focusing on the required forms for volunteering with the Forest Service and other natural land management agencies. So those two forms mainly consist of the OF 301A and the OF 301B, and then we'll dive a little bit just very briefly in timekeeping and recognition and how important it is to being a volunteer, and then also helping us achieve our ultimate mission. And then Kevin's going to talk a little bit about some of those real world implementation stuff. We'll do a quick Q&A, and then we'll go ahead and adjourn. So first off, I just want to give kind of a larger overview. What can you do with the Forest Service, and what volunteer opportunities do we offer? And really, it's unlimited. We offer a ton of opportunities for individuals out there. You can go look on sites such as volunteer.gov and get hooked up with local ranger districts outside of your local area if you want to travel far and wide. Volunteer.gov is one of the greatest resources we have for recruiting and figuring out volunteers in the Forest Service. There's also just reaching out to your local ranger district, forest, regional forest, seeing what's available in your local area or an area you're interested in volunteering. But just a ton of opportunities, a ton of different skill sets that we are looking for, but also willing to teach, and just a lot of great people, both agency staff, partners, and volunteers. Just a wide range of everyone out there, all dedicating their time to helping us conserve and protect national forest lands. So like I said, pretty much anything you want to do, you can probably find somewhere in the United States Forest Service, from helping us manage developed and dispersed sites all the way down to wilderness areas, packing stuff in, crosscut saws, all that good stuff. More developed sites, if you're not that mobile, or if you like to just talk to people all day, helping us out at our visitor centers and front offices. We always need the assistance. There's always lots of questions, always lots of people who want to know stuff. So helping out with our primary points of contact is really helpful. If you want to get out into the field and actually do stuff in the field, you can join our trail crews, our conservation crews who focus on, wildlife, archaeology, protecting archaeological sites, and just restoring the environment. You can also do education, both to adults and children. Whatever you want to be, however you want to be involved in education, we always need educators. And then, developing interpretive programs, anything like that. If you want to get more involved, education and interpretation are big areas we're always looking for help on. And then we also offer a whole bunch of special projects and one-day projects like National Public Lands Day, National Trails Day. If you work full-time, you can't dedicate a ton of time to the Forest Service or to a volunteer position, these one-day events are a great way to get involved. But lots and lots of opportunities out there. The only things that volunteers can't do are firefighting, law enforcement, and representing the union. So pretty open, you can do a lot, and really just get really great experiences. So something I found pretty impressive when preparing for this was the Volunteers in the National Forest Act has been around since 1972. That's 50 years. So that's not all that long in the grand scale of things. So the Volunteers in the National Forest Act allowed the Forest Service to accept volunteers and to go out and to recruit so that people could help us manage the landscapes that we manage. Before 1972, we weren't authorized to accept volunteer services. So in the past 50 years, 3.28 million people have volunteered their time to the National Forest Service. This is equivalent to about 141.1 million hours, which is pretty impressive overall for just 50 years. That equates to $1.85 billion based on the independent sector valuation of the volunteer dollar, which is sitting right around $23+ right now. So for every hour you volunteer, that's $23 equipped on the independent sector valuation. So in the past 50 years, volunteer time has equated to about 76,000 full-time employees for the Forest Service. So for an agency about 30,000, that averages right around 30,000 employees, that's pretty impressive. That's more than doubling our workforce. So really, for all of you volunteers out there, appreciate what you do, and we really do appreciate how you're helping us care for the land and serve the people. So looking at pathways to volunteering with the Forest Service, there's really two main volunteering ways there's really two ways you can volunteer with the Forest Service, and I'm going to talk about one other too that's just really important. So the first way you can volunteer for the Forest Service is as a direct volunteer. So this means individuals or groups who come to the Forest Service and say, hey, I want to contribute my time, and then we sign you up under the OF 301A agreement. So you're working directly for the Forest Service, helping us accomplish our mission by signing up as a volunteer. That's the first way you can get involved. The second way to get involved is through partner-led volunteer opportunities. So these partner-led opportunities are the partner themselves, who are usually bigger than just a smaller organization, volunteer group, or an individual. They tend to have some staff, they might have some funding. These groups come to us and say, hey, we have a similar mission to you, and we want to help you accomplish your mission, but also engage people in our mission. And so we usually engage with these people through a cooperating or partnership agreement that gives us a lot more flexibility. We can share funds, we can help staffing in certain situations, just different ways that we can help each other. But really, these organizations come to our rescue, and we talk with these organizations and say, we need help accomplishing this. Can you help us with this? And then these organizations step up and say, yes, we can help you, and here's how we can help. So there's hundreds and thousands of organizations like this throughout the United States and throughout the world that can really help in this way. But just a couple that I have worked with in the past: the Arizona Trail Association, Washington Trails Association, and the San Juan Mountain Association. These groups really do come to our rescue and say, how can we help you? And they just do it. So they're absolutely key to us, and you might interact with these groups more than the Forest Service, actually, because there's so many out there. But just important to know that if you're working through a partner, we're still coordinating with these partners. You're still helping us achieve the Forest Service mission. And then one other thing I want to talk about is our service participants, just because this is a program that the Forest Service really uses to try and engage youth or younger members to become engaged in natural resource management and cultural resources. So if you're high school age and you want to look at a career in natural resource management, the Youth Conservation Corps is a great opportunity. We have them at our ranger districts. You're treated like a Forest Service employee. You go out on a crew, you do trail work, you do trash pickup, you do wildlife surveys, you do everything that a Forest Service person does at a very young age. And so we're introducing them to the workforce, we're introducing them to the volunteer workforce. And another great one is, if you're college age or recent graduate, is that 21st Century Conservation Service Corps. We pull a lot of our staffing from there, but if you're in one of these programs, more than likely you are working with our volunteers in some way, shape, or form, and you're learning from our volunteers, our already established volunteers. So it's not really a volunteer opportunity, but it's a great way to recruit volunteers, especially young ones. So wanted to point that one out also. So we're going to be really talking about those direct volunteers at this point. So those people who serve directly to the Forest Service under a volunteer agreement, which is standardized across the forest, the OF 301A form. This form is, sorry, I don't know if you can see that. This is a 2-page form. So it really looks pretty simple, and in essence, it is pretty simple, but there are some really key things that you as the volunteer should be looking at before you sign this volunteer agreement, and that the Forest Service or whatever land management agency you're working with, because this is a multi-agency form, it is used by the Park Service, it is used by BLM, and other land management agencies. So if you're going between all these agencies, this should be a pretty common form. But we really want to say, what does the volunteer service agreement do? And what are some things to really look at when you're filling it out or when you're reviewing it with your partnership coordinator or group leader? So what does the agreement do? So it serves as the official contract between the volunteer and the Forest Service. It clearly states service expectations and requirements of the volunteer. It's used as a tool to evaluate safety and logistical information relevant to the volunteer service. It documents any allowable reimbursements for out-of-pocket expenses, and it makes the volunteer eligible for workers' compensation. So for 2 sheets, that does a lot. So we're going to go through it step by step. The volunteer agreement is really kind of 6 different parts, and we're just going to kind of point to important things for you to know in each of those 6 different parts. So section 1 of the OF 301A form is just your general information. We want to know who you are, and we want to know kind of your background a little bit, just to help us understand who's volunteering for us and how we're outreaching to you. So pretty simple. Most of it's just your information, but the first thing to note in the upper corner here is the expiration date. This form is reviewed every 3 to 5 years by all the agencies and then our lawyers. And it does get updates. Most of the updates aren't very major, but it does go through an update phase. And so you really want to make sure that your current volunteer agreement is under the most recent form, just because things do change and that we might have added benefits in future forms or things might be taken away. So just make sure you're operating under the most current form and that it's not on an expired form. So that's important to notice. The next big thing to notice is that the 301A is for individual and groups. So in the past, the Forest Service and other agencies had 2 separate agreements, one specifically for individuals, one specifically for groups. That's not the case anymore. So we've combined this to a single form. If you're an individual or a group, this is the primary form you're going to be using to document your representation as a volunteer. So that's important to note too, is that you should have this no matter who you're volunteering for. And that's pretty simple from there. So the name of the group or volunteer leader completing the form, just first and last name. For if it's a group agreement, and your group leader should be someone with some authority in your organization. So it should be a president or someone who has the authority to sign that on behalf of the group. So just make sure it's not someone off the street that you just say, hey, do you want to represent our group? Make sure it's someone with that authority to sign and make decisions for that group. For the individual, once again, just your basic information. We do have a citizenship question there. If you have issues with that one, just talk to your local representative and see how you can work stuff out. Just because it varies by place, how they deal with that situation if you don't want to put that down. So please just talk to your local representative on that. Other than that, just your basic contact information. And then the last section is optional, but really we do appreciate it if you fill it out, just because again, it's all demographic information. And what it does for us is it really helps us determine who is actually volunteering for us. It also helps us figure out who are we not reaching as volunteers and can help direct us on how to be more successful as an agency and embrace a much broader diversity of volunteer partners. So you don't have to fill it out, but we really do appreciate it because 1, it tells us who's volunteering for us, and 2, who are we not getting as volunteers that we need to do better outreach to. So pretty simple overall. We're just basically asking for your information in this first section. Section number 2 is the emergency contact information. Once again, very straightforward. This is just who do you want, if something happens to go wrong in the field, who do you want the Forest Service or your group leader to reach out to deal with that emergency situation, to help facilitate control of that situation. Some lessons learned that I've had in the past is a lot of the times we have partner couples who volunteer for us in the same capacity. So they're both out in the woods at the same time. And if something were to happen to both of them while they were in the field, who would we contact? So put some thought into this, especially if you're an individual and your spouse or partner is volunteering with you. They're probably not the best person to put on this volunteer form, the emergency contact, just because if something does happen, then we have no emergency contact to reach out to. In terms of groups, once again, really important that you that you list someone who has some authority with the group, or at least knows what the process is if something goes wrong in the field. So you don't want to put your spouse who isn't even involved with the group as the emergency contact for the group or anything. So put some thought into this, who you list here, just because, you know, if everyone's out in the field and the emergency contact is also out in the field and gets impacted, then we're kind of left in a rut there. So think about it, put some time and thought into it before you put this down, but pretty simple overall. Section 3 is what the government completes. So this is something that is really, really important for you to review as a volunteer, just because this has the bulk of the information in it that you need to follow, that you need to know before you start volunteering, and also has some key features in here of special stuff we authorize for volunteers. So once again, multi-agency, so we always want to list what agency you're officially volunteering with. Every volunteer is assigned an agreement number. This is a 16-digit code that is unique to every single volunteer. And it's not all that important to understand what this number is, but if you're interested, here's a quick breakdown of it. The first 2 digits are the fiscal year that the volunteer agreement is initiated. So if you started volunteering this year, which is fiscal year 23, because our new year starts in October, then that 23 would stick with you throughout your entire Forest Service career. So even if we get a new form in 2025, that agreement number would still stay 23. Just because it's the year that the agreement is initiated, and not updated. So 23, whatever fiscal year you started, that's the first number. We have 2 different letters that can be used for the next one. VI is used for individual agreements, or VS for group agreements. So that's just a quick way that you can look at this agreement and say, okay, this is a group agreement versus an individual agreement. The next 8 digits really just specify the location that you are volunteering the majority of your time in. So this is just an example using my current location at the regional office in the Rocky Mountain region. Number 11 is the number representation of the whole Forest Service. So if you're volunteering for the Forest Service, this number will always be 11. The next step down is the specific Forest Service region or station, which refers to our research stations that you may be volunteering for. So once again, out of Denver in the Colorado Rocky Mountains, so I'm on region 2. Oops, sorry. And then the next breakdown is the forest level, which I don't know why the regional office has a forest level, but we do. But whatever forest you're working on is designated a distinct number, identification number, and then same with the district. If you're operating on a district, it all has its own unique number. So it just tells us overall, where are you spending the vast majority of your time volunteering? And then the last number is just the sequential numbers for each agreement. So if I have seen volunteers in fiscal year 23, the last number would be 0016. So just in case you ever wanted to know why what that 16-digit code is. It really tells us what year did you start volunteering, what type of volunteer are you, and where are you primarily focusing your volunteer efforts for. And so one important thing to notice, if you're working on a district level, definitely put that district level down. If you're working on multiple districts within the Forest Service or forest wide, definitely just go to the forest level and have a signature that indicates that. That way you have that flexibility, and you can work all over the forest. So that's the volunteer number in a nutshell. It really comes into play in two different areas. One is for reimbursements. Our processing center won't even look at a reimbursement without this number attached to it and the volunteer agreement So if you've been approved any way, shape, or form for reimbursements, you need to have this number. The other place is if you are injured and we have to report that injury through our safety system to state that you are an active volunteer, we also need that for that case. So you don't need it all the time, but it is a really great thing to have and know if one of those two situations happens, if you need a reimbursement or if you are injured in any way, shape, or form. So after the agreement number, just basic contact information. Kevin, do you go? Sorry, I saw you go.
Go ahead. I'll wait until you get through. And then before you leave this screen, I'd like to just recap something.
Okay,
sorry,
no problem. No, you're good. So the next thing is reimbursements. So reimbursements are pretty limited overall, but it is an option to have them for general travel expenses, for lodging, and a couple other minor things for volunteers. So if your organization or if your volunteer coordinator says you are authorized for reimbursements, talk through that with them. So you know exactly what you get, and you know exactly what is being for. And that really comes at the local level. I came into a ton of detail about it at this level, but talk to your local people, figure out if reimbursements are authorized, and if not, don't even worry about it, just because it's a conversation that's not worth having for the most part. But if you are authorized reimbursements, it has to be documented on this form, as well as the type and rate of the reimbursement. So just make sure you're talking with your volunteer coordinator or group lead, so you know what is and what is not authorized for reimbursements. After that, volunteer position, if you have a specific title, go ahead and put it in there. This section down here is really the meat and potatoes of the volunteer agreement. And between the volunteer abstract and these boxes down here, this tells you what you can and cannot do as a volunteer, and also just mentions any certifications or other things you may need to go through in order to start your volunteer service. So here's a really quick example of a volunteer description or abstract. You can see it's pretty short, but it's got a lot of detail in there. And this tells a whole lot to me as the manager and also to you as the volunteer. So the things are, you can see what you should mention up here in the description, but they do a pretty good job of breaking out in this one, in that, you know, the location is the Patty Canyon Trail System. That means you can more than one trail. It's a whole system of trails that you can operate on. Your dates of operation are June 1st through September 30th. So probably not during the snowy season, but during the summer season, that's the bulk of your work going on. Hours are flexible between 7:30 a.m. p.m. And that's really just key for, you know, travel, thinking about travel too, and all those other things that go into the logistics, especially if you're working in remote locations. And it's flexible so that you can work anytime in between those hours. You kind of have to fall within the Forest Service working hours, which is 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. After that, we're qualified to get overtime and all this other stuff. So most volunteer agreements you'll see cut off at 6 p.m. But once again, something to talk with your local managers about, what are the best core hours for your particular volunteer position. And then the description really tells you, you know, what's the job you're going to be doing for this specific example, it's maintaining trails. So it says specifically here what your goals and objectives are. And it also tells you the tools that you can use. So that first paragraph just basically says, here's what your goal and objectives are as a volunteer for this department. And then the second paragraph there really describes the requirements for that position. So you need to be able to work in all weather conditions. There may be heavy lifting, long periods of standing, and you will be required to carry at least a 20-pound pack. So that really tells you as the volunteer, here's what the expectations are that I will be held to so that I can accomplish these tasks safely and efficiently. So it really tells the volunteer what you need, skills you need, and what you're going to be accomplishing. So, and it's really hard to do this in a short paragraph and document everything that you may be doing. So that's why we have this section down here. The check all that apply is that the first checkbox is a description of services attached. So if you can't fit the description in this little abstract area, or if you're working multiple volunteer activities, so you're on the trail crew, plus you're on the green crew that goes out and picks up trash at our dispersed areas, make sure you have that green team description attached to your volunteer agreement also, just because you're performing both duties. If you need to drive a government vehicle for any reason, either transporting other volunteers or you're the only volunteer and the Forest Service has a truck available, that's if you're driving the truck, you need to have a valid driver's license, and that means a valid state driver's license. And you've also gone through the required training through the Forest Service, usually a defensive driving course, and been issued a government driver's license or a letter of authority to drive a government rig. And so that license or letter of authority should be attached to your volunteer agreement if you are allowed to drive a government rig. Medical clearance required. I've never seen this used in all my career, but I know that some places very well might. Typically what I come to is that if you can't perform a required duty in the job description, we look for accommodations that a different volunteer opportunity serves you better, or is there some sort of accommodation we can give so that you can actually do the job in some way, shape, or form. So I've never actually had this one checked. The only one that comes to mind is if for some reason a volunteer is driving a commercial sized rig and is required to have a commercial driver's license, then Forest Service employees are required to have that medical clearance. The volunteer would also be responsible for those requirements. So, but once again, I've never seen it used in my volunteer career. If you're a group, then is your sign-in sheet attached, or is this a special event and is your sign sheet attached? We'll be going over that in a little bit more detail later. Background investigation. Certain positions are required to have background investigations with the Forest Service. It really breaks down into 3 different areas, but really, once again, this is a conversation to have with your local unit to figure out what their requirements are. But generally, it's if you have access to a Forest Service administrative site without Forest Service oversight. So if you're in there alone working, just sensitive information in there that we want to make sure that you might not, we want you to have a background check before we know you have access to it. The second part is if you have access to our computer system. So if you're working a front desk and have access to a computer to issue permits or just check out information, you need a background check. The last one is pretty much anytime you're working with youth, specifically youth without the parents there or without a Forest Service representative there, you need to have a background check. But those are very generalized overviews. Talk to your specific on-site representative to get the full ins and outs of those backs. And then the last thing attached should be your risk assessment, which is, we used to call them JHAs, job hazard analysis. It's just a safety checklist, a safety check before you start any activity, or before you start an activity, or before you start doing something new in the field. So those risk assessments, there should be one associated with each volunteer description you have, and then there may be additional ones associated with each project you are working on. So those are all the check boxes. Once again, very general overview. We can go into more if we need to. We can go into a lot more detail if we need to, or do a different presentation if there's more specific questions on those. So that's kind of all the government information. Like I said, it's kind of the meat and bones where the vast majority of the information is held. So make sure you review this information. And if you need to negotiate stuff out, this is the time to do it, is in this section. If you can't do something that is required by that position, figure out what accommodations you can make. And so really important, just review it and make sure that it fits your needs and the government's needs. All right, Kevin, your turn.
Okay, just to reiterate some of what Chelsea said, if you are a volunteer, your main thing that you want to review, again, is that description or the activity abstract, as it says there. A lot of the stuff around that, the administrator or Forest Service liaison for the group will fill in a lot of that stuff. I know for some districts, district rangers have to sign off on individual driving permissions. So just remember, or even for reimbursements, different things get reimbursed at different rates. So just talk with your Forest Service liaison. If you are a Forest Service or National Park, BLM agency administrator, basically you're going to want to make sure that all that stuff around there is filled in, and then work with the volunteer to make sure that the description is accurate to a large degree. I mean, other things are going to happen when you have doing trail work. You're not going to list out everything you can do in trail work, but the general topic, make sure it's there and move on. So that's all I wanted to say there. Thanks, Chelsea.
Yep, thanks, Kevin. And I think, you know, what Kevin said is really important here, is that not everything is going to be listed out in this volunteer description, but anything that does require a special certification should be called out in your specific volunteer agreement. So if you're allowed to, if you've gone through crosscut training, chainsaw training, or ATV training, all of those things should be specifically listed on here saying that you can do it. So anything that requires any sort of certification, make sure it's listed. Otherwise, yeah, if you fall without, if you're falling outside of your volunteer agreement, then and you're injured, then we won't cover you for injury. We won't cover the costs of your injury. So if you've put the time and effort into getting certifications, make sure they're documented on this form. Okay, so the next the form is not, most people don't fill this out, but if you are a volunteer who is under 18, or if you have a child who is volunteering for the Forest Service who is under 18, or any land management agency, this is a required section. And it, once again, pretty simple in that the parent or the guardian fills out this top part with all their contact information so we know how to reach them. And then they say the name of the youth, and then they sign off saying, hey, I understand that this is a volunteer position, and my under 18 child or individual can volunteer their services at this point in time. So so most of the time I see this section blank on volunteer agreements, but if you do have a volunteer that's under 18, this is really, really important, just because youth come with a lot of different rules and regulations. And so just as a special note for groups, if you are under a group agreement, it is the responsibility of the group leader or the group associated with the volunteer event to get this permission. So we won't, the Forest Service isn't going to go out and do it for you. It does fall on that group leader. So just if you're working with a school age group, for a bunch of youth for some reason, then just make sure, I would just copy out a bunch of different copies of this specific section, send it in, get all the signatures ahead of time if possible, and then attach those all to the volunteer agreement, just so you have that documentation. And like I said, more for managers and for group leaders, but it's just realize that youth are treated very differently, and anyone under the age of 18 must comply with federal and state child labor laws. And so those volunteer coordinators or group leaders, just make sure you're familiar with them, because some weird things are pulled out, and youth are not allowed to do certain things that general other people would be. So it's just important to note, especially if you're leading a group, check into federal and state local child labor laws. Section 5, this is kind of where you sign away everything to the federal government. 5 different check boxes, pretty simple overall. The first one just says, hey, I understand that I'm a volunteer, that my agreement can be terminated at any point, and that I may be required to get a background check. That's all that first checkbox does. The second one is more related to if you are producing something as a volunteer that the government is then going to use, that product then becomes property of the United States. So we're not talking about your cell phone videos or cell phone photos from a group event. This is really, if you're producing something for us, and that's the intent of that, then that will become the property of the United States. So the best example I have is we were working with students at Northern Arizona University. We signed them up under a volunteer agreement, and they were really working on creating really spiffy maps, trail maps for us, and kiosk maps. So we gave them access to Forest Service computers, Forest Service GIS layers. They created these maps. Those maps then became the property of the United States government. So once again, not talking about your cell phone and photo and personal cell phone videos or photos. This is really has to be called out specifically in the volunteer agreement. So that's the second one. The third one is really important. So I understand the health and physical condition requirements for doing the work as described in the job description and at the project location. So this is really making sure, did you actually review the project description and do you know what's expected? The next one ties into that, into the upper one. It says, I know of no medical condition or physical limitation that may adversely affect my or members of the group's ability to perform the service, provide the service. So once again, this is, did you read the description? Can you do all the duties associated with it? And if you can't check that box, then that's a talk with the Forest Service liaison, the program manager, whoever it is, to say, how can I best do my volunteer duties while still meeting the needs and requirements. So that's the last one. And then the last one is photographs. I can see being photographed. So if we want to publish pictures of your group event online on our Flickr account or in a publication of some sort, we can't do that without your consent. So anymore, I always say, anyone who has consented to having their photograph done, let's have a group photo. So just realize that we have to get your consent in order to use your photo in publications and post things online. So you can agree or not agree to that. After you check all the boxes, then it's pretty easy. List the federal agency again, just because once again, multi-agency station, and then require your signature and then the signature of the government representative. The important thing to note on this is the government representative can't just be any government representative. It has to be someone with authority to sign the volunteer agreement. And that's because of the liability associated with injuries. Because we accept that liability, it has to be a line officer or someone who has been delegated with that authority to sign it. So if your volunteer coordinator is signing it or a wildlife biologist is signing it, then it's really important to say, hey, do you actually have the authority to sign this document? Typically it's district rangers, regional foresters, foresters or forest supervisors. Those are really the only three people who typically have that authority. So if the signature is not one of those three, then you probably have an invalid volunteer agreement. So just another thing to watch out for at the very end here as you sign your volunteer agreement. So the last section is really, really simple in that it's just the termination. So this can be a mutual agreement. This can be just an agreement that by a decision by the Forest Service saying, hey, you violated some sort of code that we need to follow. We're going to terminate your agreement. Lots of situations, but we do have to document termination of the agreement. Once again, pretty simple. We just need the date that it was terminated, the total hours completed, and then that signature of the government representative again. And that's the whole volunteer agreement. So 2 pages, once again, on the surface, really, really simple. It's the same one, it's the same form for both groups and individuals. It's just diving into that meat and potatoes portion that the government complete a little bit more to make sure that, one, they're getting everything accurately documented, and then also that you can meet the needs and qualifications of particular volunteer positions. So that's the 301A form. We'll touch briefly on the OF 301B form, which is just the sign-up page. It can only be used in conjunction with a fully executed 301A, and all this is it's a group sign-up form. And so if you're having a large group, if you're hosting a National Public Lands Day event and you have a large group, this is an easy way to just document everyone who is there. But you always need to fill out that OF 301A first and have that available for those people who are signing in on this to review, so that they know what those qualifications are and what the skills required are. So used in conjunction, and you still need, any volunteers that are under 18, you still have to document. So once again, print out a couple copies of those parental consent forms from the actual 301 and just have them sign it out on the spot is the easiest way I've seen to do it. So if you come to an event and all you see is the 301B, go ahead and ask to see the 301A. That way you really get to see what the job description is. Some places will have that, not all will, but just know that there is a 301A that exists somewhere that has to be tied to the 301B. So that's just the sign up form. The other really important thing for volunteers to do is timekeeping. And we do have a form for this, and it's really crappy. I'll just admit that one. We haven't done much. It's not technologically savvy. It's just a paper where every day you say, here are the number of hours I've done. And so it's really hard to keep track of these papers. I don't think it has an e-signature on it at this point, anything like that. So this is our official form. And Kevin's going to come on and talk about how groups and others have really improved this process for the Forest Service and how they've simplified the time tracking efforts, just because we have been very unsuccessful at it in the past. So really, it's very important to track your time, track your accomplishments. One, because you have so many accomplishments that you make, and being able to tout those is really, really important. But also just because we have a really neat recognition that we can do for people who track their time, and for people who actually do make improvements to the forest and the lands that we administer. So if you're tracking your time, recognition can vary from certificates of appreciation to national awards signed by the president or the chief of the Forest Service, depending on what you're going for. But we do also have the interagency volunteer pass. Every 250 hours you donate, you should receive this pass free of charge. And this gets you into all national park units, free all day use Forest Service units, stuff like that. So it's an $80 savings if you donate up to 250 hours. And every year, every 250 hours you donate, you get a new card. So pretty sweet there. Here's some example of national awards, National Citizen Stewardship Award to natural restorations. You get challenge coins, different things like that, which are really cool. Down here at the bottom is some national wilderness awards that we give out every single year to volunteers and others who contribute to wilderness. So really cool swag if you can document and track your time and accomplishments. And that's all I've got. So I'm going to hand it over to Kevin, who's going to talk about the Poudre Wilderness Volunteers and some of the stuff they're working on.
Thank you, Chelsea. I don't have any presentation, so to speak, because it's hard to fit into the time period, going through a whole different system. Needless to say, there are other volunteer groups out there that have more in-depth systems where it's basically push button functionality for the volunteer agreement, like Poudre Wilderness Volunteers has. And it is also for collecting your time. Different volunteer groups do it online or have their own forms. As long as it gets back to the Forest Service so that we can enter it in on our corporate data systems, we're all good. But in the future, if there's enough interest and volunteer groups want to know how to do the online recording of time or the online filling out of the volunteer agreement, the 301A, we can go through that. But you do need to have an online presence as a volunteer group, database and whatnot. So I think I'll leave it at that. And if there is more interest, we can talk about doing another presentation another time on that. Thank you. Questions and answers?
Okay, well, what I would like, we'll queue some questions up. If you are here and you'd like to ask Chelsea or Kevin a question, let's go ahead and queue those into the chat and we'll start there. And then if we have, I think there's few enough of us here that we can just open the floor to questions as well. Just raise your hand and we'll look for you and call you and have you be able to ask your question in person. So while everybody starts thinking about that, we do have one first question here, is which Forest Service person should we contact to get a volunteer agreement? Yeah. At what
I would
level
say,
do you usually try to work these agreements?
yeah, and I would say that it depends upon where you're going to be. The district level is the best level to start at with the Forest Service. So their front desk receptionist should know if you're going into the Forest Service or contacting the Forest Service online. They can redirect your email to the appropriate person, whether that's in wildlife or doing wildlife, helping out in wildlife surveys, stacking fire, or doing trail work with the trails person. So I think that's where I'd start out, is at the lowest level.
Yep, I agree with Kevin. Start at the lowest level and then work your way up. And that's just because mostly the district staff are dealing with the volunteers and on the local level and on the ground. So it's easiest just to reach out to the district, and depending on what sort of services you're interested in doing, they will direct you to the correct staff to help with that.
Some districts do have district volunteer coordinators. Other times it's a duty is assigned to a visitor information specialist or to the recreation specialist. Yeah, volunteer coordination ends up in a lot of different hands based on where the district is at. But yeah, start at the front desk and they'll help you figure it out from there. So another question that might be a little more difficult here is, does the Fish and Wildlife Service use these forms as well? I know there's been some effort to try to make these forms universal across all the land management agencies. What's the status, Chelsea?
So I'm not so sure about Fish and Wildlife Service. So I will dig into that one and find the answer for sure. My initial gut reaction is because they work under a similar department as us, that they would use the same form as a base. Yes, but I don't know that for sure.
Mhm. All right. And Cricor has asked the question about the use of the volunteer forms again. Do you need one OF 301A and one OF 3B for every person, or can you combine everybody onto the one 301A and then use the roster for all the people? Just repeat that again.
Yep. And so and different places do this differently. So just realize that. So it will really depend on your local unit and how they want this done. In my experience, what I always did with volunteer groups was I had the group leader complete the 301A form so that I had their contact information and knew that they were the group leader. And then everyone else in that was associated with that group signed up on the 301B form. So I didn't have individual agreements for every single volunteer that was associated with a group. I tried to keep it as simple as possible by just having the group leader fill out the 301A and then everyone else fill out that 301B. I think some people will say they have a really hard time getting everyone to sign off on that 301B, especially if it's a larger group. So some groups that does not work for. If you're sitting right around 20 or under, I would say that's a really good process. If you're sitting over 20 volunteers, then you might want to look at some other form, either having everyone fill one out, or I know Kevin deals with this one more, so I'll let him talk on that.
Yeah, and it is difficult, as Chelsea said, for a large group. I mean, PWB is 320 people. Trying to get everybody to sign even multiple 301Bs, it was just proved to be impossible, basically. And now that we're online and everybody just puts their profile information in, which will fill out the 301A form, they just have to push a button. It prints it out. They can digitally sign it now, email it in, we save it. We have to have that form. We save it electronically, which saves file space, and we're done basically. So, and the ranger signs it electronically also.
All right. So
the line officer. So.
Echo asked about the recording of this session. I will repeat that this session is being recorded and will be posted on the NWSA website in our webinar section so that we can have access to it in the future. And we have quite an extensive library of wilderness stewardship subjects and topics for people to go back and look at from the last several years. So here's another question for you guys on how long is the volunteer agreement effective? Is there a normal termination date, a standard default, or is each one unique and individual?
Each one is unique and individual, so it's effective until terminated. And that's why that termination portion is so important. If you decide not to volunteer anymore, that is the official cutoff date. So all volunteer agreements are effective until terminated. You just might need to switch the form based upon if the form is expired or not. So confusing, I know, but yeah, until terminated, the volunteer agreement is valid.
And I will say for a large group, what we went to is basically just calendar year, January 1 through the end of the year, because people come in and out of the group and we want to make sure we capture that they're no longer in the group. So if something happens, we're not covering them. So basically we go January 1 to December 31st anymore with all of our agreements.
And so that can be unique to each ranger district as a policy. Yes. Okay.
Yep, and that's what it's sounding like. And I know no matter what, our Forest Service policy is to review volunteer agreements annually. So no matter what, we should be looking at them, whether that means you put an expiration date of a year on each one and then reissue them, or whether you're just reviewing it and continuing on with the same one, you still accomplish the same thing with both those, with doing either one of those. So yeah, it could be either way.
Okay. Well, Kevin, there's several questions asking more about the online database. So I think maybe we can see if you would be willing to come back in January or February and do another session.
And actually, that would be fine. I'll get the person from Poudre Wilderness Volunteers who actually knows it a lot better than I do. Yeah,
Okay.
I'll check with them and see if they wouldn't mind doing that.
All right, we'll bring you back for a future webinar. So Donna Stevens, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you, Randy. So I have a question. This happened, I work for the Upper Gila Watershed Alliance, and we do some work in the Gila National Forest. And in 2018, we got a grant from the National Wilderness Stewardship Alliance to do tamarisk removal in the Gila Wilderness. And the Forest Service had us fill out a volunteer service agreement. And this was a little confusing to me because we weren't volunteering, right? We were getting paid to do this work. And what they explained to me is that I might not personally be volunteering my time, but as far as the Forest Service was concerned, we were volunteers because they weren't paying us. So we had to fill out this form, and I see that it is an OF 301A. And it detailed the work that we were doing, and the Forest Service filled out that part of it, and then I signed it. But I'm wondering if that is, if you need to do that, if you need to have a volunteer service agreement for doing work with the Forest Service, if you have grant funding to do it, or if things have changed since 2018.
Nope, the short answer is yes, you still need that volunteer agreement, because even though you receive grant funds for reimbursement, Donna, you still need a mechanism that authorizes you to do work on the national forest. So just, as an individual, you can't go out and do work on the national forest. That would be construed as trespass, or the actions that you took could be creating damage, So the volunteer agreement covers you as an individual for authorized work performed on the national forest, regardless of whether you're paid or not paid. Anyways, I think our grant programs are technically not contracts, so you're not really contracting with us or with the national forest, but you're receiving a reimbursement for certain expenses for doing work on the national forest.
Okay, well, that makes sense. I just, it seems like we've received other grant funding since then, and we haven't had a volunteer agreement. So I don't know if something just fell between the cracks, or.
It probably just fell between the cracks. There should always, unless, because they don't terminate, they may still be operating under the same volunteer agreement that you had back in 2018. Since they
I don't see an
terminate.
expiration date on that one, so I don't know, but I'll find out. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, well, any other questions? We don't have any more in the chat. I haven't seen any other raised hands. Go ahead.
Randy, let me throw in also, there's another option too. If the group has Adobe Acrobat, you can actually create a Acrobat fill in the form type volunteer agreement. So you don't need to have an online system. The volunteers will type their information into that form, digitally sign it, and send it in to the liaison also. We did that for a year until I realized how much work it was on the liaison, and then we did it online. So, but that can be done for smaller groups.
Okay, well, on behalf of NWSA and all of our wilderness stewardship groups, we want to thank you, Chelsea and Kevin, for coming and sharing about the volunteer paperwork associated with being a volunteer on the National Forest. And I think we'll have you back, Kevin, and bring a compatriot to help talk about the online version of these forms, so that can make everybody's life a little easier. I will note that our next webinar coming up in December is a look at the future of NWSA. No, we're not going anywhere, but we are making some changes, and our board has been going through a process with some consultants to improve our management and organization of the organization. We are looking at making some staffing changes and bringing on a new executive director yes, I am going to retire, do a second retirement here sometime in the next year. But we are looking forward to continuing our programs and our funding programs, and we just want to share with everybody what the latest progress in all of those efforts are going to be. So come and join us next month to learn more about what the future of NWSA looks like. It's a pretty bright future. So thanks, everybody. We'll go ahead and close out our session today, and we'll look forward to seeing you next month.